Hey everybody, it's Birdie from My Favorite Quilt Store, and I'm going to work with you today on turning this pattern, which is called Windswept, which is in fall colors, which I just think is beautiful, into this blue version of Windswept. And it's just put together, it's basically the same quilt, just different fabrics, but it's got some different stuff. You're using different colorways than what they did here, and I've given you notes. And I hope you watch this video because it'll help you turn this pattern here into this beautiful quilt. You get the instructions in the box that looks like this, and that's obviously a different colorway quilt. So I'm going to try and walk you through all the steps because even the cutting directions are different in this one compared to this one. So we're going to give you some special, like my tips for cutting and stuff like that when you buy the pattern. And then we're also going to have this video for you to use it, and I highly recommend that you use both of them. Because of the nature of this main fabric, the forest stuff, it's a directional fabric, so that means when you're cutting all of these triangles, the big ones and the little ones, you've got to deal with making sure it's going in the right direction. But the other thing is, because it's the way it comes off the bolt, it also means that you're going to be working with biased edges. And sometimes that scares people, and I don't blame you to be afraid. But you can tell before these are sewn together, this is a 10.5-inch ruler. This is what I use to cut them. But after I cut a few using this 10.5-inch ruler, I felt like I could get better cuts, kind of like fussy cutting them, so to speak. I wound up just making a freezer paper template of this size, the 10.5-inch square cut in half. And then when I place because if I just place like a ruler here, and then you wind up cutting it right down the middle, you may not get an animal in the right place. So that's why I just cut triangles rather than squares. And we need to point out is, you know, you've got, this is the center section of the quilt from here, and these two are considered borders. So you've got stuff that has to be going the right way. For instance, this is going the right way and it's pointing that way, and this one's pointing this way. And then you've got this one where the cut's different. So you have to be very mindful of that. And I put that in my notes, and I'm hoping that I explained that well enough. So that's the first issue is working with biased edges. I think it freaks people out sometimes because you do get a little more stretch. So what I like to do before I cut is I starch my fabric. And I do that on the back side of my fabric. And I give it a few seconds before I just iron it into my fabric, because I want it to soak into all of the fabric. I think that's how you get the full benefit of using starch. Instead of just ironing right away, it kind of stays like just on the surface. And I want it to go into my fabric, and it's going to help stabilize it before I start sewing with it. In this pattern, the one that you get with the kit that has the main directions, these are actually from a panel that you cut in half to get the 4 sections. But when you see this fabric on the bolt, it's just a border print that's only running on one way. So you wind up cutting it, and the directions tell you to cut it to 12 by 42. But when I squared up my edges before I cut them, I could only get 11 inches because they kind of gave the 45 inches exactly. And I think that the fabric person, they probably should have given you, because they give you they tell us how much to cut for each kit. And I think it would have been wise if they gave us a little bit more than I think it's 3/4 of a yard, or no, 1.25 yards. But anyway, so this winds up being a little bit like 2 inches more narrow than what the pattern calls for. But in my tips to you, I gave you specific cutting instructions on every piece of fabric that you're using, and I tell you because even if you compare this photo to this, the whole colorway is all different and not just different colors, but like I'm using the most framing fabric is this blueberry print. So I gave you instructions on how many strips to cut so you can start using this. And I did that on every one that every piece of fabric. You don't go by these cutting instructions. You'll need to use the handout that we're going to put in the pattern with you. In my notes, we're going to give you an insert showing you how you sew your rows together on the diagonal. It'll be marked and I can give you more specific notes. But if you've put a quilt together on point before, it'll make a lot of sense. But if you haven't, because all it is basically you're sewing 2 rows together in sections and then adding this and finishing the row up here. But I will give you more specific instructions when in my notes you'll see. The next thing that I wanted to talk about is after I got this whole center section done, I went ahead and I left it up on my design wall because I thought it was easier to handle it that way, and I took my long 24-inch ruler and I marked and I trimmed to where my seam allowance was exactly 1/4 of an inch, because again, dealing with the bias fabric, it may not come out equal, and a lot of times if this isn't, since it's not on the outer side of the quilt, you wanted to make sure you squared this center section up. And then add, once you finish these side borders, you added, they would sew together really nicely. When making the side borders, you can follow the instructions that are in here, but just remember you're not working with a panel, you're working with yardage. And that does mean that just like the picture shows you that the top part of your quilt up here, this is upside down, but that's staying true to the pattern, and that's just what we're going to be dealing with. Some people have an issue with that, but you do get you're really looking at just the corners and the way it works out together. So, and the instructions are really good in this fall color pamphlet showing you how to build these and everything. The only thing that you have to be cognizant of is that this is not one triangle here, it's 2 of them, because you've got a top half and a bottom half. So you just have to be careful when you're cutting your small triangles as to what way your fabric, the direction of your fabric is going. And that's the same, like I said, on this center block here and here, because your only fabrics that are directional are going to be the forest, and they're calling this a bluegrass, which is the border fabric, and then this other one, these, when you get this piece of fabric and you open it up from your kit, it's like a half a yard, and you actually have 4 of these seams. You're only going to use 2 of the 4, but if I remember correctly, the bottom one that's closest, that like on the selvage, does not have this green line, or this blue line, excuse me. So you want to make sure that you don't use that one. That gives you 3 other ones. And the other part that was a little tricky is building this block, because you've got to cut this. I made it to where it's hard to see, but I didn't cut off the tip of my tree. It's there. But then above that is another blue line used. And you can see it's got the blue line at the top and it's got the blue line at the bottom. This blue one up here doesn't get cut off all the way, but it becomes your seam allowance. So you'll see you put your ruler here and you get that seam allowance. And then this one, gets, so that blue one's gone, but you want to keep, maybe you don't want to keep, but they did put that blue line in there, and it is part of this piece of fabric, not this. And this is your emerald, that you can see my seam is like right here. And then once you figure it out, you sew this top piece to this bottom piece, and then you can trim it to 14.5 inches. And the way I determined that was a 14.5 inch square is it tells you what size to cut your square your squares in the cutting instructions. So I actually did what they said, and I made my cut, and then I sewed the 4 of them together, and it came out to be a 14.5 inch square. That's what these should be measuring. This one and the 2 top and below pictures at 14, not 14.5, I'm sorry, 14.25. Okay, sorry about that. The other thing is, if you're still having issues after you watch this video and look at my notes that I made for you, you can always call the shop and ask to speak with me, and I'm pretty sure I could walk you through most issues just over the telephone. So just tell customer service that you wanted to talk with Birdie and what quilt you're having issues with, and I'll probably have to call you back at some point, but we can work that out. I've done that several times on other quilts that people, customers have questions with. So please feel free, because it is such a pretty quilt when it's all done. I just love it. But it is a little bit complicated because we did not get the instructions on how to make it in this colorway. So hopefully what I've done for you today is given you enough tips and hints and stuff that you can make your quilt and it'll be even prettier than mine.